Major funding for this series has been provided by the Alaska Humanities Forum, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the University of Alaska Southeast, with additional support from the State of Alaska Department of Health and Social Services and Sea Alaska Corporation.
We all need to know who we are, where we fit, and how we relate. To do this, we communicate with each other. But communication is always approximate and never perfect. It is hindered by our differences, our experiences, our cultures. In this series, we examine miscommunication between people so we can better communicate across cultures. Our presenter is Father Michael Oleksa.
Thank you. Well, welcome back for our final segment of our four-part series, Cross-Cultural Communication. The first episode we devoted to our own culture, which I defined as the global literate culture, the culture that defines itself in terms of writing and which has by now imposed itself, or intruded at least, into the cultures of every village and hamlet pretty much on the face of the earth. The second program was devoted to traditional cultures, the wisdom of the ancient peoples of the world whose cultures were not based on the written word nearly so much as the spoken. The third, perhaps the most pessimistic or depressing of the three in our series, discussed the clash between the two worlds. Now, we're not to blame, and it's not a matter of making anyone feel guilty about the tragic miscommunications of the past or the injustices that were perpetrated by one culture against another. That's not the point. That's not what we're hoping for here. It's rather to make us all sensitive to the fact that those wrongs, those injustices, and that miscommunication has happened, and people not only have but continue to suffer because of it. When you ask majority people, is there trouble in your community with discrimination and prejudice, they pretty much say no, hardly at all. And when you ask racial or cultural minority groups, is there a problem, they say, yes, we suffer from it every day of our lives. And you want to say, well, who's telling the truth? Metaphorically, I compared this to growing up playing basketball or growing up playing soccer. They both have the term dribble, but they both mean something very different when you ask a player to do it. And in fact, dribbling in basketball is completely against the rules in soccer, and vice versa. And we live in a kind of society where that kind of miscommunication interculturally is happening all the time. And whoever is in the lower power bracket will suffer for that breakdown more. The student in the classroom, the patient in the hospital, the applicant in the job interview, the defendant in the courtroom. And this is where the patterns of discrimination, in fact, emerge. So we want to talk in this fourth and final segment about this universe of communication, how it is that people interact and understand each other. You know, it's something miraculous, almost magical, to think about how language itself works. Before I can say anything, at least theoretically, I have to have an idea in my head. And then during the first couple of years of my own life, I've been taught a particular language so that I can articulate, without saying it, I can articulate that idea in words before I actually say them. Then over a still longer period of my life, I had to learn to make the sounds to articulate those words. That's a different task. Then I start sending out these sounds, and your ear picks them up. And as long as everything's connected properly and working, your eardrum vibrates in a certain way, your auditory nerve picks up those vibrations, and your brain gets this stimuli. Then someplace else in your brain, that stimulus has to be converted into meaningful sound. If I speak in a language that you don't understand, it won't be meaningful. If I translate my whole lecture tonight into German, Arabic, or Tlingit, only a few people in the room will understand, even though their eardrums are working perfectly well. So communication can break down at that point too. And then finally, you have to interpret those words, hopefully to mean something like what I meant in the first place. To get the idea into language, I can choose the wrong words before I even say anything, and the miscommunication has already occurred without you knowing it. Or I can mispronounce the words, or you can mishear them, or you can choose dictionary definition number 5 when I meant that word in dictionary definition number 2 or 3. In other words, we can miscommunicate anywhere along this chain of events, from idea, the mental concept, to the formulation in language without saying it, to the articulation of it, the speaking of it in language, to the hearing, the reception of the message, to the interpretation of the message, and finally something like the idea that was in my original head getting into yours. Folks, if that works, it's amazing. It's not so surprising, therefore, that we miscommunicate. What's surprising is that we communicate at all. And it's always imperfect. It's never accurate 100%. I can use a word like dog, and immediately that sound, provided you speak English, triggers a concept in your brain. A four-legged, usually, furry mammal of sorts, kept as household pets or work animals, depending on your culture. I don't think that's the Webster's definition, but it will do. But I may mean my dog. I may mean my half chow, half husky, I hope safely tied in my backyard on 6th Street and not wandering our streets this night. If I mean that dog and I want to get the concept, the image of my dog into your head, I have to say more than dog. I have to give you hundreds more words. I have to describe her personality, her color, her shape, her weight, a whole lot of other details. It will take me an awful long time to get the idea, the concept of my dog into your head. And even then, it will still only be approximate, but there will be overlap. That's the image of communication on my little chart here. Now, what if I say the word animal, and I'm a Western European, and you, as a native Alaskan perhaps who has learned English, hears the word animal. To me, an animal, as a Western European, is probably an inferior being of less intelligence, less sensitivity, with a smaller brain, and therefore less up here. Something we can run psychic experiments on in the lab. And to me, as a native Alaskan, on the other hand, when you say animal, it means in some ways a creature superior to us, who sees better or hears better or smells better or does a whole lot of other things better than we can, including fly without an airplane. Another creature not inferior, but perhaps even in some ways superior to human beings. It's interesting, you know, in European folklore, it's always a curse to be turned into an animal. But in Native Alaskan stories, you can often live happily ever after in animal form. So when I say animal, and we both speak English, are we communicating or not? Depending on the context, we can both be speaking the same language, but there's no overlap. And yet we think we're communicating. This is a breakdown in communication due to all the cultural factors we've discussed in the last 2 or 3 talks. And this is inevitable. Communication, therefore, even between people who speak the same language, is always approximate and never perfect. Every married couple knows this. However, there's more to communication than that. It's more than just language. Long before we began learning our first language, whatever it was, we began getting programmed, you could say like they say in computer labs, initialized or formatted. Our brain needed to get prepared to receive the linguistic data. And that process began probably in the womb. Long before, years before we actually say anything intelligible, our brain is already developing the initial skills we need to actually speak someday. Now, speaking is a very complicated process. You have to have those ideas and all that language stuff, and that's up here on the tip of these sort of metaphorical icebergs I've had produced here on this chart. These are icebergs. Please use your imagination. This is the water line. And we'll come to the musical staff later. It has nothing to do with the icebergs, actually. It's just a convenient shorthand here. The icebergs float the way human beings interact. We show only the tip of our personality publicly. The language we use, the communications that using verbs and nouns and adjectives and so forth, that's pretty much up front. Everyone can hear it or overhear it. That's what I would refer to as the tip of the iceberg. And this is the part that's always approximate and never perfect anyway. And that's the best we can do. But long before we reach the ability, the stage of being able to speak in full sentences, we are being programmed, as it were, to eventually be able to talk. The first element of our personality, as well as our speaking style, is put into us possibly, as I said earlier, even in the womb, because it's a biological, physiological rhythm. We all have one. Some people, depending on their culture and their family and their background, and certainly even their genetic inheritance, have a rhythm that runs like this. This is perfectly normal speed for talking, for walking, for eating lunch, and for enjoying a pleasant stroll. People walk and talk and eat at this pace. And then there are people from other parts of the world whose metronome is set much faster. They walk and they talk and they chew their food. It takes them 5 minutes for their hour lunch, so they have plenty of other time to do a lot of other things. Try Manhattan, it's like this. An entire city whose rhythm is set at high speed. And if you don't walk this fast, you will be trampled on Broadway. Step, 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 step. This is the rhythm of the city. Rural areas tend to have somewhat slower rhythms. Everyone who's lived in an Alaskan village knows how tiring it is to come to town. It's not because you're lazy, and it's not because you require ordinarily an afternoon siesta, although it's a wonderful institution. It's not because you always take a nap after lunch, but when you come to the city, the whole rhythm of the place wears you out. You can't speed up your metronome without expending a whole lot of extra energy. And there are those who have a governor on just how fast their metronome can speed up. It doesn't go any faster than that. That's our personalities. We never think about this, you see, especially in conversations. When we teach people second languages, we never point out that those languages have rhythms too. And unless you learn to talk at that rhythm, the rhythm of that language, you will never communicate effectively. Rhythm is basic. It's so fundamental that complete miscommunications happen all the time based on the rhythm factor alone. And again, those of us who are married know that this is true. You come home from the office, your spouse is already there, a little bit more relaxed, having adjusted himself or herself to the rhythm of the home, which we hope is a little more relaxed than the office or the expressway. It's not a good time at that juncture to deliver memos. Because quite literally, the person on the faster beat, who has not yet slowed down and adjusted to the more relaxed pace of the home, is going to be ticking away like so. And if you deliver the message off the beat in a syncopated way, it doesn't compute. Not because the eardrum suddenly deadened or the auditory nerve went dead either, but because we need to be synchronized to effectively communicate. We have videotapes of school teachers recently imported from elsewhere, whose rhythm is quite rapid. In a classroom with students whose rhythm is much slower. And the teacher asks the student a question. The teacher expects the answer to be on the beat and is waiting for the answer now. And the students are answering, but later. We have to videotape such classrooms to prove to the teacher that the student answered at all. They say, no, she never answered my question. Yes, the child did, but not on the beat. And if you don't communicate on the beat, it doesn't compute, it doesn't sink in. The instructor will say, they never answered. Now, if this is the story of your school experience, if this is what happens to you when you go to school, first, second, third grade, and you're never in the Bluebirds or the Redbirds reading group, you know. You're in the Blackbirds for this. You're in special ed for this. You're in special ed for this. Because such children are not only rhythmically diagnosed slower, they're intellectually considered slower. And it's not true. They're just as bright as the other kid. But their culture and their physiological metronome is set at a different pace. And it works both ways. I was at a school in rural Alaska not too many months ago. The teacher had been here 20 years. She came to school every day and barked as the principal of the school to her village students, walk like you're going someplace. And they'd all speed up. Until they got around the corner, and then they'd all slow down. The real problem was the whole village was only 200 yards long. When she said, walk like you're going someplace, no one had any idea where they were supposed to be going. Now, this factor alone caused a great deal of tension within that community. I was called in as a consultant to try to help people make sense of this. And as I talked about the faster metronome, the whole student body smiled and nodded and looked at the principal. But it didn't work the other way around. She never got the notion that rhythm was her problem, that she was the only one trying, as her mission in life, to speed up the rhythm of the entire community. She got fired. It cost people their jobs. Very competent people are forced out of their positions in which they're perfectly competent to perform, because they can't adjust to the rhythm of that culture. When you deliver a memo to your hubby, your honey, off the beat, they don't hear it. And then the next day you have a fight. But dear, I told you yesterday. I reminded you. No, you didn't, dear. We've all had those discussions. You weren't synchronized. Eardrums were working, brains were engaged, language was fluent and articulate, but the message doesn't get through unless you share the rhythm. Basic. It's something programmed in at the very bottom of your personality and mine. As you can see, that's not the only factor programmed in. There's the tones that we learn. What do we mean by tone? What's a high pitch in your language and a low one? It varies cross-culturally. In English and Northwestern European languages, we program the tonal system of our language into our babies by giving them every possible note the human voice can make. You know how we talk to little babies. The tinier, the more this is true. This is the music that infants hear the first days, even hours of their life. We squeal at them. In English. In English, we squeal at our babies. We hit notes far above the musical staff that would really be off my paper here. And we slide all the way down and hit notes that we would never use with other civilized beings. We do this only to babies. So the baby already in infancy, and we're not conscious of this, of course, anymore as we get older, has learned that when people talk to you like that, that's a good thing. We like that. And so, as we get a little bit older, the tones somewhat are condensed. Still, for very young children, preschool kids, kindergartners, adults talk in those tones. Not quite as extreme, we say, to the first grade class. Good morning, boys and girls. if I came in here this evening and talked to you in those tones? You see, those tones send a message. They say, I'm an adult and you're a child, which is very reassuring when you really are a child and this person really is an adult. Because I'm not just a generic adult, I'm an adult like your mommy and daddy. You see, I know how to talk to you. The same way your relatives talk to you in the cradle. This is subliminal. We don't realize that that's why this is reassuring as a 4-year-old, but we tend not to like it anymore by the time we're 9. Mr. Rogers talks this way. There are an age group of children who really appreciate his sing-songy voice. But then children reach an age where his neighborhood is off limits. You don't want to be talked to as a child anymore. Now, not all cultures squeak to their babies. How high is a high pitch in your language? How low is a low pitch? It varies cross-culturally. The music of Russian is quite interesting, actually. I've sat through many a lecture delivered by Russian Americans who have learned English perfectly well. They know the grammar, they know the syntax, they know the vocabulary, they're quite articulate, but they still speak in the Russian tones. In the Russian tones, you always go down the scale. In fact, every sentence goes down lower. In the 3rd sentence, you go lower yet. In the 4th sentence, you are starting lower and you are falling down further. In the end of the paragraph, you are groveling. This is dynamic Russian speaking style. But it puts the rest of us to sleep. Now, what happens if you grow up in a Native American, or perhaps Japanese or Hispanic household? The tonal system programmed into your infant computer is a very different one. People from those cultures don't hit those high notes or those low ones. Mama and Papa talk to their baby in exactly the same music that they would use for adults. Pretty much in the middle of the staff, something like this. Ta-ta, 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 ta-ta. Now, there are more tones in Latin American Spanish or Japanese or most Native American languages. If Mama has an important message to deliver, if she has an order to give, something in the imperative mood, she raises her pitch and goes ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. It's up there. Dad would never touch that note. That's the female note for orders, commands, and warnings. When Papa has something serious to say, usually speaking on the middle of the staff, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, under ordinary circumstances, when he has something serious to say, some order to give, some forbidden edict to issue, he says, mm-mm-mm. And when Dad speaks on that low note, you better listen. Now, what happens to a child from this second category, whose parents have always spoken to them, ta-ta, 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 whose mother goes ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta in case of warning or danger, and whose father goes for the same message? What happens to that child when he hits kindergarten and Miss Jones says, "Good morning, boys and girls"? Folks, if this is danger, this is hysteria. The woman is out of control. Run for it. This is not soothing, welcoming, caring, sensitive adult speech. This is verbal terrorism. And yet the teacher has no idea that that is what she's doing to those minority kids in that classroom. Has no idea. She doesn't mean to be doing it. It's tackle basketball. And the kids are getting tackled and nobody noticed. Juan and Diego go out for recess. Why does our teacher shout all day? I don't know, let's ask Billy. They go to ask Billy. Billy says, she doesn't shout. And they back away from him. All these tones send messages. In the same community where I had this rhythm problem last December, I tried an experiment with the kids, the entire student body, probably about 80 children, ages 3rd grade through maybe 10th or 11th, actually. And I said, who in this room can hear the difference in the message I'm sending between these two sentences? I got all my homework done. And I got all my homework done. And the kids stared at me. Huh? Okay, let's try a different one. I didn't forget my airline ticket. And I didn't forget my airline ticket. And they stared at me again. Okay, I got my lunch money in my pocket. And I've got my lunch money in my pocket. Still a room of blank stares, with the principal with the rhythm problem nearly jumping out of her chair, so furious. Why don't these stupid kids get it? It was written all over her face. Finally, a bright 10th grader raised his hand and said, I'll take a guess, Father. It seems to me that the second time you say this, you're happier about it. Nope, sorry. They couldn't hear the difference. They'd never heard that intonation meaning something like sarcasm. You idiot, you forgot your lunch. You fool, you didn't do your homework. They weren't getting that message at all. And it was quite obvious, at least I'm just making this supposition, the principal was also sending those kind of messages to those students all the time, and they weren't getting it at all. Talk about frustration on both sides. So the music that we learn is programmed into us in infancy, and we take for granted that everyone knows our music, our tonal system. It's not true. Now imagine how this might apply in a job interview, for example. You ask a minority person who has a second type of tonal system programmed in, tell us a little bit about your job. Oh, they say, I really like my job. Instead of, I really like my job. The next candidate uses the tonal system we expect. I really like my job. Whom do you believe? Who gets the job? We communicate on the tonal level, not up here in the words that we actually speak, but with the rhythm and the music we also employ every time we open our mouth. And by the way, men, this is the bad news. Women tend to pay at least as much attention to these kind of signals as they do to the words you say. I came home not many months ago from a long trip, dragging my suitcase through the door, and my daughter, Katrina, was waiting for me. She said, I waited up to see you, Dad, because guess what? I got the lead in the school play. And I, dragging my suitcase through the door, said, oh, that's terrific, honey. Two weeks later, in a completely different setting, we were having a slight disagreement. She said, and you didn't even care I got the lead in the play. That wasn't my recollection. I remember being very pleased. I remember saying so. My son backed me up. I said the right thing at the tip of the iceberg, but my tone said I could care less. And she heard that tone more clearly than the right words that were uttered officially at the top. Where do we get the message? How do we understand the message? Dr. Deborah Tannen at Georgetown has written several bestseller books on this topic. I refer you to those if you're interested in exploring this further, especially the second one, You Just Don't Understand. It's about husbands and wives, men and women, trying to talk to each other, because that is definitely an intercultural situation, if there ever was one. Volume is another problem. How loud is loud? How soft is soft? To the Irish, I'm told, we Yanks are always loud. We're considered boisterous and and domineering in their pubs. We come in and we talk over their music while they somehow manage to talk under it. I don't know how to do that, frankly. But apparently the Irish know how, and we don't, and it's a cross-cultural breakdown. We have a reputation of being boisterous and domineering in their country. They probably like us anyway, right? But what happens when someone has a tonal system that's wider than you're used to? Or a volume setting that's up a decibel or two? Or perhaps a rhythm that's more rapid than yours? In other words, what happens when you meet a New Yorker? You see, the whole country has this stereotype of New Yorkers being rude and pushy and arrogant and domineering. Now, there probably are a few like that. But by and large, that's not the way New Yorkers perceive each other. You see, in a New York conversation, you've got to keep things moving. Everybody's on that rhythm that we've already mentioned. And then, you see, there's a politeness system operating here. We call it the solidarity style of politeness. In solidarity style politeness, you see, the basic premise is this. We human beings are basically alike, we're the same, and we're equal. Americans like that assumption. We're alike, we're the same, and we're equal. So two Americans meet. They shake hands. Dr. Daniel Jones, please meet Dr. Jeremiah Crawford. They'll shake hands and say, nice to meet you, Dan. Good to meet you, Jerry. They're not just on a first-name basis, they're on a nickname basis, and they've just met. New Yorkers are like that, too. They want to say, I'm the same as you. We're equal. We're alike. In this mad city of 11 million people, let's prove it. You start talking, and I'll empathize with you. I'll agree with you. In fact, I'll be in such solidarity with you, I will finish your sentences for you. Because I knew what you were going to say. I would have said the same thing if I were you, and I'll prove it. I'll say it for you. I'll do it. This is not rude. This is not impolite. This is saying we're so much alike. I know you so well. We're so closely related. We've been together for so many years. I know you. When I finish your sentence, it affirms you. It doesn't interrupt you. It says, we're alike. We know each other. Tell me more. You take a New Yorker to San Francisco and they try that. And they come across as rude, arrogant, boorish, domineering. But they're simply employing a politeness style that's different. It's not, in fact, even uniquely New York. It's, in fact, the preferred style in our country generally. Perhaps not with the finishing of one another's sentences, but we Americans prefer the solidarity style of politeness. The other major style is the deference style. It's the way most of us were raised in the 40s and 50s and earlier. Children were taught to be deferential to adults. You never called them by their first name. You called your next door neighbor Mr. this and Mrs. that. You called your school teachers by that. You used titles in deference style politeness. You don't use nicknames. You don't even use first names. We know how to use deference style politeness as soon as we recognize that we are not the same and we are not equal and we are in a hierarchical or ranked situation. As soon as we realize that we're outranked, we switch to deference. We all know how to talk to the arresting officer. We know how to speak politely to the judge in court. At least if you know the ballgame rules in our dominant culture. You know that even though the judge has his full first and last name up there on the bench, you don't use the first name. You don't come into the courtroom and call the judge Frank, even though that's what it says. But not everybody's going to know that. Because different cultures use deference style politeness in certain situations and solidarity style politeness in other situations, and they don't necessarily match. So when you use deference and when you use solidarity varies cross-culturally. In Great Britain, deference is still very much in vogue. Two British doctors with the same names I mentioned earlier meet. Dr. Daniel Jones, please meet Dr. Jeremiah Crawford. And they will shake hands and say, so pleased to meet you, Dr. Jones. Happy to meet you, Dr. Crawford. Perfectly polite. They're both being deferential. You're a doctor, I'm a doctor, I respect your, oh, please, after you. No, no, after you. Deference. What happens when the English doctor meets the Yank? How you doing there, Dan? So pleased to meet you, Dr. Crawford. These guys aren't buddies. This is not hitting it right off. We're playing tackle basketball cross-culturally again. One is being deferential, the other is using the solidarity system, and they offend each other. The one who's using solidarity sends the message, I can be forward. I can assume to use your first name because, after all, we're alike, we're the same, we're both doctors, why stand on protocol? That's what Americans will do. It gives us a bad reputation in countries where deference is the expected politeness system, because we come across as forward, arrogant, domineering, and pushy. Sounds like New Yorkers. We're not trying to be any of those things. It's the message we send, not by what we say, but how we say it, by the style we use. This varies cross-culturally. It's going to be that way. We're not a melting pot after all. The world is not a melting pot, and our country is not a melting pot, no matter what Teddy Roosevelt or George Bush said. We are a salad bowl. And in a salad bowl, there are many ingredients, and we're glad for all of them, because a lettuce salad or an onion salad would be rather unappetizing. The lettuce has to be glad that the tomatoes are in there with the baby corn, the broccoli, and the green peppers. The more the better. Each one adds a flavor and a texture, a color that enriches the whole thing. And that's the kind of society we have. That's the kind of world we live in. And we have to learn that there are different ball games in town. Solidarity-style politeness is very much our preferred way. It's increasingly so. But I mention this because in different parts of our country, deference is still taught to children. A young man told me a few weeks ago in Anchorage that he moved from Mississippi to Ohio as a fourth grader and was constantly being sent to the office. He said, why? He said, I didn't know for years. Well, what happened? He said, well, you know, the teacher would say, Billy, will you do this? And he'd say, yes, ma'am. And she'd say, go to the office. He'd go to the office. The principal would say, why were you sent here? He'd say, I don't know. Call the teacher. Why was Billy sent to the office? He was wising off. Because a yes, ma'am, or a yes, sir sent the message that they were being flippant and disrespectful. He was saying yes, sir, and yes, ma'am because he was being precisely respectful and polite. But his politeness system was rude in the new context. And it took years for him to find out, and he was in the principal's office time and time again for 4th, 5th, and half of 6th grades before they sorted it out. A conflict between deference and solidarity. It happens. We can't tell ahead of time what system the other person is going to use. Finally, distance goes with volume and style here. What if you meet someone, as we once did in Anchorage, from West Africa in this case, who's not only a faster rhythm and uses a very wide range of tones. These were Nigerian students we brought in by the dozen to enrich our university campus and cultural life. And while they had a different tonal system and a different volume setting and a different rhythm, it was the volume that really frightened most people most of the time. Plus a distance problem. Distance is something else that gets programmed in early on. Can I have a volunteer from someplace over here? Sir, thanks. Will you step up here, please? You see, when people are talking, we're used to having them at a certain, what we consider appropriate distance. English speakers require or expect arm's length. Frenchmen require sleeve length. Italians require elbow length. And if I'm an Italian trying to talk to this gentleman, what are we going to do? Now, my Nigerians were used to the Italian distance, and they spoke several decibels louder than we do. So a Nigerian conversation was something like this. Thank you.
Thank you.
That sends a message to the person you're trying to talk to. If you stand that close and talk that loud, it sounds like the person doing the talking is angry, hostile, maybe ready to bash you. And when you are the members of the football and soccer team, all 6 foot plus, 200 pounds plus, you're rather intimidating to everyone smaller. So after 6 months in America, my Nigerian friends had not a single American or international student colleague. No one ever came to their rooms. No one ever sat at their lunch table. No one ever invited them to go to a show with them. No one ever studied with them. No one even walked to class with them. That sent a message. When you're the only blacks on campus, how would you interpret it? They came to me and they said, you know, Father Michael, racism is a much bigger problem in America than we ever dared imagine. How else could you analyze that? So we had a meeting. I gave a talk like this. We gave them the whole iceberg theory of communication. And it took 10 years for those Nigerians to automatically, without being reminded, to speak at the volume level we were accustomed to. We developed a kind of system. When a Nigerian's talking to you and you think they're too close or they're too loud, call time out and back away. To remind them that from our perspective, they're too close and they're talking too loud. And they would learn not to be offended by that. But it didn't come automatically for a decade. That's how hard it is to change these things about yourself. Your mom and dad put it there. You learned it from your parents. There's an inference then, you see, that they did it wrong if you have to change it. When you say to someone, your way of talking, your politeness system, your volume, your rhythm, your tones are all wrong, it says, your mother's no good. And them's fighting words. It gets very emotional and very sensitive. And lastly, I have one element here that is perhaps just as critical as any of the others. Our ritual system. You know, cultures have rituals. We have the ritual way of saying hello in English. You say, hi, how are you? You call on the phone and you say, hello, this is so-and-so, may I speak to so-and-so? These are ritual questions. It's expected that everyone in the culture knows how to play the ritual, play the game. If someone says, hey, Father Michael, I want to talk to you, without a hi, how are you at the beginning, I'm in trouble already. They've come to the main topic too quickly. You have to talk about the weather or something. You have to ease into the main topic. You can't come too abruptly to it. And saying goodbye is the same thing. Think about it on the phone. We, in standard American English, require at least 2 goodbyes. 2 goodbyes is the minimum farewell. I got to be going, okay, see you, okay, bye-bye. That's 2. Okay, that's all I have. Okay, me too. Okay, see you. Okay, bye. You need 2 goodbyes. If people say, that's all I have, click, it sends a message. I said something wrong. They were offended. What did I do? Better call them back. Because the ritual must be followed. Otherwise, it sends the message that there was a breakdown. Now, in Yupik Eskimo culture, there are no particular words for hello or goodbye that are used on a daily basis. You don't have to say hello to people to start a conversation. If you're standing in front of them, you can talk. When you're done, you can leave. People call on the telephone and say, where's your wife? And I say, Mom, it's Minnie. I know. You're supposed to recognize their voice. They live next door. They call every day. You know who it is. Why go through the ritual? In that culture, there isn't any such ritual. And when you're done with the conversation, you say, okay, that's it. Okay, bye. 1 goodbye max. Now, what happens when Yupik Eskimos meet the rest of us? They come across as being abrupt and rude and discourteous because they don't say the hellos and the how are yous. I once made the mistake of doing that, you see. I called my wife's village, Cuitluk. I was calling another household, and the grandfather in the house answered the phone. Now, I was ready to talk in Yupik, but culturally I hadn't adjusted. So I said, Waka changajit. Hi, how are you? And he told me for 20 minutes. I got his medical prognosis. I had his chart practically in front of me. I knew what medicines he was taking. I knew when his next appointments at the hospital were. And then I said, can I talk to your daughter? He said, "She's not home," and hung up. Serves me right. I should know better. Hi, how are you? In Yupik is not a ritual question. It's a question of substance. They will give you the facts of their medical history. A traditional person won't assume that you ask, "How are you?" without meaning, "How are you?" The same is true for farewells. There's a way of saying goodbye in Yupik. You can say, "See you around," "Dankchakamkin," but you don't have to. I mean, when the conversation is self-evidently over, you can get up and walk out the door. Now, in my family, it's very different. Eastern Europeans and many European cultures have a very elaborate farewell ritual, which we learned before we could actually speak. It's down here below the waterline, you see. We watched our parents, probably from the bassinet, enacting this ritual of farewell, typical in certain cultures of Europe and probably other places in the world. You see, I know from watching my aunts and uncles and parents enact this that it takes 2 hours to say goodbye. You look at a clock and you say, about 2 hours before you plan to leave, we really should be going soon. This means nothing. This means we're not spending the night. That's all. Everyone in the room ignores this statement. The conversation continues oblivious to the very notion that anyone might imminently depart. 15, 20 minutes pass, and the departing family or group says, "We really do have to go." And the same thing occurs. There's not a blip in the conversation. It goes right on as if no one heard that. At the third, we really do have to go, you can actually add some pretext, like, "I've got work to do at the office," "The kids have homework to do yet before school tomorrow," or "We're very tired, we've been up since whenever." At this point, the third announcement of departure, in fact, the departees may now stand up. However, those who are remaining will also stand facing them, thereby blocking any possible exit. The two groups will stand face to face until they become noticeably weary, shifting the weight from one foot to the other. This is the signal to usually send an adolescent member of the family to fetch the coats from some remote bedroom where they are all piled and, of course, all completely mixed one with the other. It takes the kid another 15, 20 minutes. We're finally going, "Fred, will you get out here with these coats? We have to go." And the child emerges, something like this, buried in the immediate family's outer clothing. We ignore this child. We only put on the coats when a significant amount of perspiration has built up on his brow. We have no choice now, you see. Poor Freddie is suffocating. We have to put on the coats. You'll excuse us now. But the conversation continues without any glitch whatsoever. It's as if we're still sitting on the sofa. You put on the coats, and everyone stands there. The coated ones now have to maneuver around the coatless ones to get their backs to the door and slide into their shoes, which are usually piled up there too, without any interruption in the flow of the conversation. It's still as if nobody's leaving. There's now graphic evidence that the coated shoed relatives are in fact about to depart, but they may not leave until they too begin to sweat. At this point, someone will say how unhealthy it is to go outside perspired in this cold night air, because by now, it's probably midnight or something. In any case, the coated and shoed relatives can now, at that point, step out through the doorway, but they remain on the porch. This is part of the ritual. None of these steps can be ignored without serious consequences. The departees now are on the porch in their coats and shoes. Those who are remaining are inside the parlor, and the door remains open. They talk through the open door. This is one of the shortest segments of the ritual, because it won't take too long for the furnace to kick on. And that's the signal for someone to say something some kind of platitude like, "We're not heating the earth, the house is not a barn, or heating oil is very expensive." This is the signal for the coated and shoed relatives to say, "Well, we really have to go," and they proceed to their car, followed by the coatless, shoeless relatives. The coated and shoed get inside and roll down the windows immediately. This is part of the ritual. The coatless, shoeless relatives are standing on the nearby sidewalk, jumping up and down to avoid hypothermia or frostbite. Only when either of these threaten the survival of the jumping relatives does the actual departure take place. It's a full 2 hours since the first, I guess we have to be going soon. I know this. I've known it since I was 3 years old. I know how to say goodbye to other Olexas. It takes 2 hours. So I take my Yupik bride to Pennsylvania. And about 2 hours before I plan to leave, I say, I guess we gotta be going soon. Ksenia got up, put on her coat, put on her shoes, walked out the door, and sat in the car. And my relatives? What did we say? Why did she leave? I'll be right back. So I go out to the car and I say, Ksenia, honey, come on back in the house. She says, why? You said we were leaving. I know, but I didn't mean it. This is what happens when your expected rituals get violated. I told this story a few weeks ago in Homer, and a woman came up to me. She said, I'm Ukrainian too. I know what you mean. I said goodbye to my father last week, and I forgot to roll down the windows. He called. Now, all of that, of course, we enact the rituals to say things that are too awkward to say out loud. You don't want to say out loud, explicitly, we love you so much, we get together so seldom, we can hardly tear ourselves away from you. So you enact it. But if someone doesn't know that that's what you're enacting and they get up and leave, it says all the opposite messages. We can't stand you, we can't wait to get out of here, and we're having a horrible time. Which is exactly, of course, the message that the sudden departure sends. How do you know those things? You don't. You can't. We're all raised in our own ball court. We're all raised in our own goldfish bowl. There's not much we can do about the fact that we all have different mothers, got different rhythms, tonal systems, and all the rest in infancy. The best we can do is be aware of those differences. Be sensitive to the fact that other people raised in different ways, in different cultures, from different backgrounds, are going to differ from us on all those levels. We need to be open and honest about the fact that we don't communicate perfectly because communication is always imperfect and always approximate because we're people, we're not machines. And then we need to be honest about those miscommunications. And finally, and perhaps most significantly, we have to be big enough to say we're sorry when we realize, unintentionally, we've accidentally tackled the basketball team. Because we do. We do it in the closest and most intimate of our relationships. We do it in our marriages. We do it with our children. We do it with our colleagues and our best friends. But there we have a commitment to fix it, to go through this process, to be open and honest, and to ask forgiveness and to apologize. But we have to learn to do that with each other cross-culturally throughout our whole society. If we don't, I think the riots of Los Angeles are just the tip of that iceberg. We need to make a commitment in a democracy to the salad bowl. Maybe we would rather have everybody be the same. Maybe the old assimilationist melting pot idea of America is more comfortable to us. Maybe that's what we would prefer if we could vote on it. But demographically, it's just not there. It's wishful thinking to believe we can return to that. Because you see, assimilation taught all those kids the Pledge of Allegiance. And it ends with those famous 6 words, with liberty and justice for all. And if we're committed to those ideals we say we embrace, then we have to make these adjustments, difficult as they are. We have to be aware of those differences and sensitive and open and honest and forgiving. And then, you see, really communicating with each other, we have so much to learn from each other, men and women, elders and youth, people of all races and backgrounds and cultures and religions, because we have them all. And then together, just maybe, we can all learn what we need to do, get a marketable skill, get our specialty, get out there and have a job, be a productive citizen in the modern world, maximize our leisure time, minimize our labor time, and at the same time, be human beings. People who know who we are, know where we fit, know how to relate, can be real people, and make the great land even greater. Thank you.
Father Olexa has suggested several books and videos about cross-cultural communication. A complete list and additional information about this series is contained in a free viewer's guide. Write to Communication Guide, KTOO TV, Juneau, Alaska, 99801.
Major funding for this series has been provided by the Alaska Humanities Forum, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the University of Alaska Southeast, with additional support from the State of Alaska Department of Health and Social Services and Sea Alaska Corporation.